Okay, so we've seen quite a few really amazing presentations talking about people, risks, and strategies, and today's our opportunity to put them under the grill, under the blowtorch. So, I think I might kick it off, and I might ask Brendan one. So, Brendan, really great presentation on recruitment, importance of selection, and getting that right to manage people coming into the business to mitigate risk. All of us have been around the table for a while. We know that sort of, pre-selection can be costly when we talk about at a workforce level, cost of doing that. And certainly you acknowledge that, and you talked a little bit about the importance of reference checks. And, are there any tips you're suggesting that supervisors and they're skilling them up, asking the right question? Any tips for our supervisors or pass them the right question or?
Sure. So I in a reference check, I use the enough rope principle. So there are structured questions that you should be asking as part of a reference check. There are a lot of the standard ones, but I like to lead the reference check as a conversation rather than being overly scripted. And that way you give enough rope for the the person giving the reference to perhaps give more information than they were intending, or to let and so the classic line, is there anything else that we should know that might impact this person's suitability to conduct the role? So, we know references are on the record as well. So it's a really powerful question to ask, to say, is there anything else we should know? Is there something you're not telling us effectively? But I always like to phrase it to set the conversation up as a conversation rather than being overly scripted, as I've said. So if you make it informal, people are more likely to give you their honest views on things.
You mentioned something else about talking to the previous employer. Now, they're not a named reference. Can you talk us through any privacy considerations?
You can't. So, people do all the time, by the way. It's so common. But you can't contact a reference without the employee's or candidate's approval. You can ask the candidate, you can say, hey, we would really like to talk to someone from this organisation. It might be that they've got very good reasons why they don't want to do that, but that can open up a whole nother conversation where you can find out more information.
Fantastic. Any questions from the audience?
Just a quick question, just to follow up on the specific topic you've got. If I'm being called for a reference, there's probably a scenario where Kim's telling me, don't tell the truth, don't be open and honest, because if you really want to say what you think of the employee, it may not necessarily reflect as fantastically as it could. How do you have that honest conversation where it might lead to a scenario where you choose not to employ that person?
Yeah,
and it comes back to me on my organisation or as an individual?
Really good question. And there's a really the simplest answer is I'm not prepared to comment on that. That's not me, by the way. As soon as you say that, you raise a massive red flag for the person conducting the reference check. So, would you say that the person was always on time? I'm not prepared to answer that. Or, okay. So you're covering yourself, but you're giving enough information to the prospective employer. There's not much more that you can do, unfortunately.
Jadine, I'm actually going to ask you a question because of something that you presented that sort of alerted my attention just to some employer queries. You talked about coaching and training and the difference. I'm just curious around emerging issues, which we spoke about early on in the presentation. I think, Simon, you talked about it. How do you train or coach people around emerging issues when, for many people, they can't quite grasp if they haven't experienced? So do you find that it's diluted, or how do you bring that to the table?
Yeah. So I think this nicely links into just the previous conversation, the discussion that just happened, talking about the relationship between managers, people and culture, your risk management team or injury management team. So from my perspective, there should be ongoing conversations taking place within an organization about some of the potential risks and also how to manage either potential risks or current risks. So from my perspective, obviously through training and coaching, we want to provide people the education and information and skills that they need to manage risks. But if they're in a situation that maybe they're not sure whether it is a risk or if there's something they could be proactively doing about it, them having different points of contact within the organization that they actually feel like they can go to and be like, hey, I've got this member of my team, they're presenting with this. What are your thoughts on this? Should we be doing something about it? And also having that environment of psychological safety that they feel like they can do that and that they're not going to be persecuted for doing so and speaking up.
So, I mean, talk a bit about emerging of, talk about people risk and 25 odd years in the industry, we've seen a lot of change in terms of people and the risk attached to our humans that work for us. What have you seen change over the journey in your time, and what do you think the emerging risks and change to clinical risk is coming, and what do you believe needs to be aware of and have to adjust?
Probably one of the biggest changes, and Kate used this phrase before, is, you know, and I was talking about this the other day, when I started out as a young budding psychologist in 1996, that's a long time ago now, it was still the era of, you know, what's upset you. I was working for a government organisation in New South Wales. We dealt with people with significant high-end behaviours, including violence, and we noticed that the guys over in child protection had mobile phones. And we said, look, could we get some of those? What for? They're going into very dangerous places. You know, someone there might get upset with them. I said, well, but every person we see is dangerous. And I was assaulted, lifted up by a young man with a acquired brain injury. Literally that cartoon moment of being picked up by your throat against the wall and, you know, belted around a bit. Luckily, I had a good mentor at the time and my training kicked in. Got a situation, got him into care. But there was no one who the following day came up and said, how are you going? I was just expected that that's part of the job, you get back on with it. Our mother actually wrote a thesis, a PhD thesis in aged care, and it was around violence in aged care. And what she found in that was it was the nurses, the carers just accepted that violence towards them was part of the job. Now we've evolved past that. So we've gone from the have a spoonful of concrete. I think potentially we may have gone too far the other way. I think, you know, some people are almost looking for reasons to be offended, to be upset these days. So we've sort of, and we often do that, we overcorrect in one direction. And I think we'll balance out. But for me, it is being accepting that we're allowed to be distressed in the workplace, that these things can actually impact on us, that if something horrible does happen, maybe have a system in place to comfort that person and help that person through it, not just go home, have a drink, spend some time with your family. Because generally what happens is they have another drink, and it doesn't get better. So that, for me, that focus on psychological health, resilience is going to be a big thing we need to start working on, and there's some good things that they're doing in some of the emergency services where there is a lot of trauma, which is you can't take someone out to a horrific road accident and say, hey, look at that enough times and you'll get better about it. They're trying to do some things through role play and case studies prior to people starting to see whether they're going to be the right fit. And if we go and look at the psych regulations coming out, that job fit, which Brendan talked about before, is going to be crucial. We are going to need to be hiring people for the job, not the bottom on the seat. I did EAP years ago for a call centre. And every person I was seeing was saying, I was told this was, you know, I just got to get to deal with people. I'm not dealing with people. I'm staring at a screen and I'm on the phone. Had one lady I worked with, I helped her change careers. She went and become a florist. And after about 6 months of me helping people move on, I get called into the company to say, what's going on? Everyone comes to see you, they leave the business. I'm like, well, yes, because you've hired the wrong people. I said, you need to go back and talk to your recruiters because they're telling these people this is a people job. And it is not a people job. It is a process-driven job with low job control that is actually making a lot of these people worse off. So now, if you know, in that same situation now, that would be a psychological hazard and we'd have to be dealing with that. So we need to get better and make sure that fit works right.
So I've actually got a follow-up question for Simon. From our perspective, we're seeing a lot of organisations having a huge amount of fear of acknowledging these risks in the first place, and even acknowledging that there's almost some legitimacy to these claims around psychosocial hazards or risks or injuries and whatnot. So how do you and your organisation, I guess, work to educate employers about their responsibilities and almost suppress that fear that they've got about just calling it out for what it is?
I'm going to get Kim as a lawyer to talk about if you don't bother assessing and don't bother finding out, what's that? How does that actually help you if you get prosecuted?
Hang on, I'm not following. Say again.
Janine's saying that people don't want to know about the risk, they don't want to look into it. Yeah. From a legal perspective, if you don't bother investigating, if you don't bother finding your hazards.
Yeah, well, obviously the worst outcome would be a prosecution from WorkSafe for failing to provide a safe workplace and not meeting your basic primary duty under the OH&S Act. And I guess, you know, because so much of what I do, I get the tail end of when everything's really gone wrong. And so it's been really fascinating for me to listen to you guys talking about it from a point of view which I don't often get that opportunity, but it's really lovely to sometimes get that opportunity and say this is what you need to do to manage the risk and the red flag employee. So that's so much of what our focus is with Andrew and the work that we do.
So it's funny, Jadine, on your question, I was actually in a meeting yesterday at a new client, and another third party said, I don't think that's good. It's good to spend money on assessing the hazards. I think we should spend the money on the interventions. To which Alex, who's phoning me, so when I started writing on the pad, but how do you know what interventions to put your money into if you haven't assessed the hazards? Being an ex-psychologist, and as Jadine, a lot of the study is statistics heavy. We actually go and try and identify what the issues are, so we know where the interventions should go. What we find with a lot of organisations is it's all anecdotal. Oh, this is our big driver, this is our big issue. But when we break it down, often what they feel is the big driver or the big issue is just the one that hurt the most at the time. And it might have been one. There could have been 100 other things going on, but they didn't hurt them as much yet. So if we don't actually do our analysis and we don't do our assessment, do we know that we're spending our money in the right direction? I had one federal government organisation we were working with, and they put this into intervention in place, and it didn't work. It actually cost them more money than they got out of it. And I said, why'd you run that? And so they said, well, such and such, was at Customs, and they ran it there and it worked really well. I said, well, I've got a mate who works at Customs. He teaches firearms training in Cat McGrath. Is that relevant to you guys? I said, no, we don't do any of that. So why was their intervention appropriate for you? And that's the bit that we often get. Oh, that works somewhere else. We'll grab that off the shelf and we'll go chuck it in here and that'll work for us. No, the whole concept of understanding your needs, understanding your hazards, understanding your risks is the first step before you bother spending money or time or effort into an intervention.
For an organisation where this is new and they're starting to look at it now, how would they go about beginning to identify a baseline for managers and supervisors? Where do they currently sit, and therefore identify where to build on that?
A couple of areas to look at. Go back through grievance reports. When you go and look at one manager getting a lot of complaints, is probably a good place to start with what are they missing. Again, we know that managers don't always get it right. They might not be an intention to bully, but their behaviour and their approach. And remembering that, we go back to that change, Travis, that go back to, I think it was 2014, Kim Fair Work took over bullying and harassment under their purview change legislation. And there's a lot of talk at that point around how management style needed to change. That the old approach of I'm the boss and you will do what I tell you and you'll learn to do with my personality is gone, and as a manager, I have to adapt my approach to suit the people on my team. So if you're seeing that old school approach and people are not changing it, that's a good red flag. Another one to look at is lag in reporting. We're still seeing people where there's 4 to 5 months, if not longer, between when the incident has occurred and when the claim's gone in. Now, a good manager and supervisor should know enough about their team to know things are going wrong. All right, Michael has hurt his back here. let's get him to lodge a claim, let's get him treatment here, not let's let him struggle on for 5 months until he can't do anything and then he finally lodges a claim. Or there's conflict between these two people here. Let's do something about it now before it blows up into fisticuffs and we get 2 claims. So those sort of things that we'll know about our managers that they haven't been reporting. So it's more you're trying to identify what they're not telling you through history, and that'll give you the guide.
My question's to Kim. Kim, in your area, what are you finding is the most common complaint coming through in regards to personal injuries?
Oh, so I defend a lot of personal mental health claims. So the reasonable management action defence. It's funny though how things have changed in that when I started doing this sort of work, Principal for City of Greater Dandenong, hi guys, back in 2014, we would successfully defend 80% of all claims. It's getting harder and harder now, and the reason for that is the perception argument. And I have tried to argue every which way to say, you know, the perception's not based on reality or it was an innocuous event. But so certainly mental health claims based on perception of bullying are paramount. Some with psych hazards coming through and the work design argument that, you know, employers need to better manage the work design and workload, that sort of thing. I see that as an emerging area. I've got one, we'll find out on Friday if we defend that one or not. So that's the main thing. I'm not seeing very many physical injury claims so much, but obviously they're so much harder to defend. But Simon sees a lot more of those, I think, than what I do.
Thanks. Follow up also for Kim. We spoke earlier around where it's inherent requirements, understanding the basics of the role as it leads into reasonable management directive or the return to work coordinators in the room sending a PD or a JTA to a psych to assess return to work.
Yep.
In your experience, the level of detail that those documents need to go into, how recently, let's say a 10-year-old one's probably not right,
No.
but what's more realistic, and how big is now assessing the psychosocial elements, inherent requirements of a job, rather than just you need to be able to lift 10 kilos?
That's
sort of
right. So the PDs, so I do loads of inherent requirement assessments, and I always make sure that I get as much detail from the employer as to what the nature of the role is, physical and mental, because the PDs invariably do not go into that level of detail across the board. And I don't want to rely on the worker going to the IME and telling them about the nature of the job. That has to come from us. So PDs are so important. But in terms of a fitness for duty assessment, if we don't have a good PD, the detail must be in the covering letter to the IME. And that's invariably what I need to do and investigate quite deeply because the PDs are not sufficient.
Can I just add to position descriptions in general that, and it's an interesting one because they have to be to a level of detail. I've actually never seen a PD in my 20 years of recruitment that helps to sell a role ever. There's such dry documents. So I'm wondering, is there from what you've got to include in a PD, is there a you know, and Andrew talked about softening the language. You know, the PDs are quite dry. Do they have to be as dry as they?
Well, it's quite simple. They need to really accurately reflect the role. It's difficult though because some people are very black and white and say, well, that's not in my PD, so I'm not going to do that. And so that's where your employment contract is so important to say, you know, you will be required to do other jobs, or you could be directed to do other roles within your responsibility or duties within your responsibility. It's a tricky one because they do need to be updated regularly. Certainly when someone has an injury, getting a little bit off topic, but you need to make sure that with the return to work duties that this is not creating a new role. Because if the return to work plan doesn't say these are temporary duties and this is not a new role, then by the time we come to do the fitness for work, they could be assessed against the modified duties which they are capable of doing and not their substantive role.
Does it create Does it create a redundancy issue as well, potentially? That the original role that they were recruited for?
Not so much redundancy, because somebody else would have stepped into the role and fulfilled it, but it's more making sure they're assessed against the role that they were employed to perform.
Just to follow on the conversation about PDs, we're experiencing select organisations now who have the risk of vicarious trauma due to work that might involve exposure to traumatic material or events. Some people who even work in a workplace health and safety, people in culture roles, something like that, they might be involved in reviewing material that's traumatic in nature. But what we're finding is some organisations actually do what you suggest of maybe sprucing up the job description, making it a bit more enticing, but then they're finding that some individuals are being placed in those roles, and from a psychological injury perspective, it's actually not appropriate for them to be working in that type of role, or maybe the support mechanisms that they would have requested to be put in place had they known that that was actually a part of their role haven't been put in place. So I think it's about striking a balance. Obviously, you want to make the role enticing so you can get some good candidates, but also having some level of honesty or authenticity about this is actually what the role requires, and maybe some people self-selecting out of the role if appropriate.
And that can actually result in a claim if people go into a role and say, well, this isn't actually what I signed up for.
Brendan, I'm curious on your comment, your reflection on Kim's comment just there is, if a PD or a job task analysis, if it's included in the recruitment, very transparent, but it openly declares that it's not a people role, it's a phone-based role, you will be dealing with complaints, you will be dealing with people, conflict, etc. Does that create, from a recruitment perspective, people just don't, they finally see the transparency and they opt out?
Look, I think that's a good thing, though, in those circumstances. What I was referring to more is that as a sales tool. So often a recruiter is given a PD to pass on to a potential candidate, or there's a PD available on the, via the website. There's not a lot about a PD that gives the real colour, I find, to a role. So taking out the workers' compensation side, it's what's a day like? What am I actually going to be like? There's a lot of duties and responsibilities, but what do I actually do? So a lot of PDs don't actually give you that kind of flavour. So, I think about, all of my role involves sales, but especially one of them is selling to a candidate, selling the opportunity to a candidate. If I just pass along a JD or PD, I get a very high percentage of people who just opt out based on the PD itself.
The other thing in there is, who here has a pre-existing health questionnaire that they get people to fill out when they're going for jobs? How many of you reference Section 41 of the Act? All right. If someone is signing that declaration, but you're not giving them a complete understanding of what the role is, so you're just going to sign, you've got your declaration, have you had a heart issues, have you had this, had that, all that sort of stuff, it's all irrelevant, because what Section 41 is saying to the person, you need to tell us if you've got any injury or illness that would be aggravated by doing this role. So if you're not giving them a very complex outline of what that role is from a physical and a cognitive perspective, then your Section 41 stat dec is going to be worthless. So I know it sounds like it's a lot of work to put that in there, but if it's not there, you're going through all this other work and with no benefit.
And you have to get them to sign a new one each time they get promoted as well, because when they get promoted, it's a new job description.
No, can't. No.
The Act says it's got to be
Can only do it pre-employment.
before they commence.
Yeah, so it doesn't apply then.
No, that's... No. So you need to understand when people move that if they're injured doing that job, that doesn't work. Just like, 8 years ago, I was a psychologist and my one of the owners asked me to help move a desk between offices. Now, if I could have signed all the declarations in the world. If I did my shoulder moving that desk, I'm still got a claim, because that wasn't what when you hired me, that wasn't what I was thinking.
Can I send you for a pre-employment meeting?
Yeah.
So I can do the pre-employment.
Pre-employment. You can still ask the same question, but you just won't have that level of protection under the workers' comp legislation. So if there is an injury, if they disclose an injury, your obligation is then to think about reasonable adjustments and to avoid the discrimination claim risk.
Yeah, sorry, mine's to Brendan. I was just going to ask from the recruitment perspective, what's your view on psychometric testing as a tool for a recruitment campaign?
So I'm not going to say I followed my brother and did a degree in psychology as well, but I did a degree in psychology. It's completely coincidental. And I kind of think so. Like my experience of using it as a recruitment tool has generally been really poor. So, and the reason is it should only be used to inform management decisions, not to be the decision making, the go no go. And most of the time when I've seen it used, it's as a go no go. Oh, that person scored this on this, therefore we can't hire them. Typically, and it also I've seen it used way too early in the recruitment process. I've seen it used after first interview when you've still got 5 candidates. I think that's a silly if you're not sure enough at you need to get down to your final 2, I would say, if you're going to go through a psychometric testing process. And even then, it's got to be to inform. Okay, so Trav can get a bit angry at times. No, so we've got this is their style, or this is and there's really great psychometric tests around there about how their management style or their personality traits. So this is how we need to manage them, not therefore we're not going to hire. Does that answer your question?
The only reason I ask is I had a situation myself, similar where I took that and the person who wants to train to implement that said to me, you will have trouble with the person will have trouble taking direction, following direction, I didn't actually go with their advice. I went with my gut. That's probably the best result I had. So I'm sort of stuck with the whole psychometric testing. That was only one example. For me, it comes down to why you're doing it. For me now, if I'm talking to clients about psychometric testing, what I'm more interested in is someone's resilience. I'm coming at from a people risk perspective. If something goes wrong in the workplace, how are they going to handle that? Are they going to be able to move through that? If they are injured, are they going to have that type of personality that will have them focused on treatment and getting back to work? They're things that, for me, in what I do, have a real world impact on the company, turnover, premium, all those sort of things. If you're doing it to magically go, oh, voodoo, you're a ENTP or an ENT. I used to do Myers-Briggs. And that means you're going to fit into the team like this. It doesn't really work that way. Jane?
Yeah, sorry.
I'm like oozing with, I just want to nerd out over this topic. Firstly, I think it's ironic that your profile said that you weren't going to follow advice and then you didn't follow their advice. I think that's, yeah, you fit the profile. Completely agree with you in that I get very uncomfortable when I hear about personality profiling being used for recruitment decisions, because at the end of the day, people can have a personality, but they can also learn different skills to manage those aspects of their personality. So even though their profile says this, it doesn't actually mean it translates into behavior. How we've been using personality profiling is actually for the example I was talking about before, the work with vicarious trauma. So we've used it as a part of their onboarding. So once they're actually onboarded to the organization, we do their personality profile. Each manager gets a personalized report with some really clear actions for how to support that individual in their role. So for example, if someone's personality profile says they're really low on adaptability to change, well then the manager's provided a tip around if there's changes taking place in the workplace, this particular person might need a bit more support adapting to that. So it's kind of just a different way that it's being used, and it actually applies in terms of preventing psychological injury because that person is being supported in quite a unique way.
I just add one caveat to everything I just said before. If you are going to do a psychometric test, pay a lot of attention to the lie scale. There's generally a lie scale built into the test. And if the person is scoring high on that lie scale, don't pay attention to anything in the test or anything they've told you in the interview. Right? I've had that with people. They go, oh, no, he was great in the interview. It doesn't matter. And lo and behold, 3 months later, everything he told us in the interview was a lie. Right, so and that is something you can get out of a test, is people trying to look better than they were. I mean, example from, and I still remember this back at university, we did I think it was Isaac's personality inventory, and a girl got 10 out of 10 on the lie scale, and one of the questions is, have you ever been late? And she said no, and we're like, Never? So traffic's never got well, that's not my fault if it's traffic, but you were late though. That's the, yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to shift gears slightly to a legislative question. Altiscript is a lot in CTP space as well, where we are seeing it's not an emergence, but we're seeing a lot of perceived moral injustice claims coming through in the CTP space. I'm curious, from those of you up there close to legislation, how you see the proposed VIC changes impacting, or if you, I guess, with the definitions changing around stress and workload pressures, are you expecting to see something in that moral injustice space, whether I've been hard done by, I've not been given a role, my workload has increased and people aren't listening? I'm sort of expecting that we'll see an emergence of more claims, not a reduction. So I'm just curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm pretty cynical, Brian, if I'm being honest about that aspect of the ledge change. So, there's changes on eligibility in terms of burnout claims, how long it can be, but what we've seen in the past where these things have occurred is that you change what you're claiming. So instead of saying that, workload's an issue, because workload's one of those key factors, is that it's now the claim is for bullying, and part of that bullying is Simon's giving me more work than he's given to Travis. So for me, it's just, but it's not necessarily going to be a big. It's just going to be a shift in how claims are submitted, in my opinion, anyway. But I'll hand over to Kim.
I think that's right. With the psych regs coming in, that will change how psychological hazards are viewed at the workplace. And as we said earlier, WorkSafe are already prosecuting on psych hazards, even though it's not been legislated yet. But I think that will change how claims are framed.
I think one of the big ironies we've got coming up is WorkSafe in one hand is actually trying to write out high job demand out of the ability to claim, but they'll still be able to prosecute an employer for the same hazard. But as Ewan said, we see it with reasonable management action. Someone lodges a claim, it's because they're being managed. They talk to someone who says, "Look, that won't get accepted." So all of a sudden, conflict, all these other issues come in the background, and we see that when they go to the IME, all those sort of things come out. As Ewan said, it'll be the same. Someone will say, "You're not going to get burnout." Oh, but I'm sure you're in conflict with someone. I was in conflict with Erin at one point, and I had too much work. I had all these things. So, being honest, I actually don't think that the legislative changes are going to make much of a difference, because, as I think I said before, they're hitting the wrong ends. They're trying to stop something at the start in a very punitive way, and they're hitting things at the end. There's not a lot being done about what happens during the claim. Colin O'Hearn, who used to head up CGU, in his response to one of the Ombudsman's reports, where she was claiming they're all immoral and unethical, he said, well, what you're saying is immoral and unethical is actually us truly trying to help the worker. Because what we know, we all see it, the workers get caught in this cycle of compensation. And it becomes self-reinforcing, self-rewarding, it becomes their life. What the agents used to try and do, and what employers still need to be trying to do, is to try and break that cycle of compensation. And that's what's missing from the scheme at the moment. And until we get back to having some levers that can be pulled to try and help cut that person, that cycle for that person, and help move them in a positive direction, we're not going to see any changes. You guys are still going to be paying more premium, and we're still going to be getting people to 130 week, at which point now we're going to try and apply a harsher measure at 130 week and cut them off. But it hasn't helped you and it hasn't helped the worker.
Okay, I'd like to just put our hands together for our panellists. Well done.